Hi, thanks for being part of this podcast today. You're listening to the Apologist Bookshelf, and I'm Gary Zacharias. This will be a third look at a book called the Holman Bible Handbook, Holman Bible Handbook. Now, as you would expect, a handbook spends a lot of time going through almost chapter by chapter throughout the entire Bible. It's got maps, it's got all sorts of things. But what I thought for the apologetics that I would focus on are some of these additions that are put in there alongside the text to give you kind of a better feel for, the big issues of the Bible. Like in this book, we've already covered the flood story, the resurrection of Jesus. We did New Testament criticism. And so I wanted to do three things today. It kind of depends on our time, but one is to look at the Exodus, people talking about the date of the Exodus. I want to look at prophets and what they were up to. 375 is the page number of that, so kind of in the middle of the book. And then I want to jump toward the end of the book and do apocalyptic writing, because I think that's fascinating. So a lot of this does have some carryover, I think, with apologetics. So let's take a look. Dates of the Exodus. Of course, the authors of this start off saying the book of Exodus doesn't really give us specific data that will link the biblical accounts with specific events or people in Egypt. It just says in Exodus 1:8, for example, a new king comes into the picture there. Now, who? Well, we don't know. It says he did not know about Joseph. So some kind of an anonymous pharaoh. You see that in Exodus 1, verses 11, 19, 22, chapter 2, verse 15. And he's called a king of Egypt. That's Exodus 1, 15 and 2:23. So they said, this much we do know. Pharaoh, by the way, the word Pharaoh means great house, and designated the monarch's residence, was used as a title for the king himself for the first time in the 18th Egyptian dynasty. And so it says, the Pharaoh of the oppression died. That's Exodus 2:23, and was not the Pharaoh of the Exodus. That's Exodus 4:19. So you have two different ones. So they said there are two main views that identify the Pharaoh of the Exodus as a Pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. Now, when was that? 1580 to 1321 BC. So that could be the one. Or a Pharaoh of the 19th dynasty. That's 1321 to 1205 BC. So the first one is called the early date Pharaoh, right? Because that's like 1500 to 1400 rounded off BC. And the other one is called the late date Pharaoh, around 13 to 1200 BC. So they said the early date, right, the one that you go back further in time, the early date has two main arguments in its favor. One, there's a statement in 1 Kings 6:1. And take a look. It says there are 480 years from the Exodus until the fourth year of Solomon. Now, we know Solomon pretty well. We've got him down. His fourth year of his reign would be 967 BC. So that yields a date of 1447 BC for the Exodus. So you take 967 plus the 480 years, and you get 1447. And now you also get a piece of evidence from Judges 11:26. It says 300 years had elapsed since Israel entered Canaan until the commencement of the judge Jephthah when he came along. So he's placed around 1100 BC. So you go 1100 BC plus 300 years, you're back to 1400 BC. So both those seem like a pretty good support for that early date. So that would, both those texts from 1 Kings and from Judges, they both seem to set the Exodus in 1446 and the conquest 40 years later, around 410 to 1400 BC. So that would make Thutmose III, the Pharaoh of the oppression, that's in the 1400s, as dated by Albright, real well-known scholar, or around 1500 as dated by Cambridge Ancient History. So who's the Pharaoh of the Exodus? Amenhotep II, maybe. Well, they said lately, people are pointing to one Greek manuscript that says 440 years instead of the 480 that we heard in 1 Kings 6:1. And it says the fact that 480 is a round number involving 12 generations of 40 years each. So it said maybe, maybe not. So it said, over against the earlier 15th century date, what about the late one, the one that's a little closer, 13th century maybe? Most biblical scholars and archaeologists conclude, if that's true, the Israelites entered Canaan around 1230 to 1220 BC, toward the end of the late Bronze Age, which lasted up to about 1200 BC. So what supports that theory? Right? Because remember, for the other one, we have 1 Kings 6:1, and we have Judges 11:26. Well, what supports the idea of an later one, which would be around 1321 to 1205? Well, here are the reasons. One, the two store cities built by the Israelites in Egypt, that's Pithom and Ramesses, you can see that in Exodus 1:11, they were built just before the Exodus. Well, Ramesses, that city, is equated with Pi-Rames, built by Pharaoh Ramses II. Now, he ruled 1240 to 1224, so look what that does. That puts the Exodus in the 13th century. Here's a second argument to support this later time period for them to come. The Transjordan, where Israel is said to have encountered some nations, well, archaeologists are saying it was uninhabited earlier, like 1800 to 1300 BC. So, maybe it was the late date that works better there. Here's a third reason. We could say maybe it's in the 1200s that they came in. Archaeological evidence says there were destruction levels in the cities of Canaan, west of the Jordan in the 13th century. And it says the Israelites burned the cities of Jericho and Ai, and the archaeologists are having a hard time confirming that these sites were occupied earlier than that. And then the final argument for the late date says the capital of Egypt was moved north to Pi-Ramses in the 19th dynasty. That's the 13th century again. So because before that, they had the capital in the south at Thebes. All right, so those are some two ways to decide as far as the dates of the Exodus. They said the strongest evidence for the early date, right, that still go back to 1 Kings 6:1 and Judges 11:26. It said many, but not all, conservatives like that earlier date. Some archaeological evidence supports that, but other evidence questions it and says maybe in need of interpretation. So in a way, it's kind of frustrating because they're not exactly sure, but that's okay. I mean, at least you're talking about some interesting time periods there. There are several good books and good articles that talk about trying to date these things. Well, let's take a look at where they have this is like halfway through the book. They have a section here called the Major Prophets. So they give you a background. What were these people? How'd they get called, and what were they up to? Well, it says God's prophets experienced the call to be his spokesperson. Right? We see that in Isaiah 6. We see it in Jeremiah 1. You see it in Amos 7. So what they did, they came along. We always think of prophets as saying, 5 years from now, 20 years from now, right? We think of that as prophecy. But what they were really doing, according to the book here, makes sense. They challenged God's people. Come on, you need to live lives that are worthy of a people that are in covenant with God. They kept saying, return to God. Return, right? There's a covenant. You've broken it. You've walked away. Sometimes the message is hopeful because God is faithful, and God has set up this covenant. He set up the covenant with David and the Levites. So at the best, the prophets were courageous. They were unafraid to deliver these messages. I mean, think about it. Most people don't want to hear, get your act together. God's upset at you. You're messing up. Who wants to hear that? So one way to take care of that is just go thump the prophet, right? So it says there was danger involved. Often God would call these prophets to confront Israel's kings with their sin. Samuel challenged Saul, his disobedience. Nathan stood in front of David and said, you're the sinner, right? You've committed adultery and murder. Well, at other times they said the prophets had all too human emotions. I mean, think about Elijah. Look in 1 Kings 19. He feared for his life and he hid from Jezebel. Jeremiah in chapter 20. He was in despair. He complained God had deceived him and brought him insults and reproach. Well, at their best, and we certainly see them at their best too, these prophets were honest. They were concerned with the truth. Micaiah warned Ahab of the dangers of going to war. Isaiah exposed the foolishness of idol worship. So at their best, God's prophets were moral people who challenged the standards for the people to have higher ethical standards. Amos challenged his people to let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. Micah, this is a pretty famous one, Micah answered the question, what does the Lord require of you? You're supposed to act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. So at their best, these authors say God's prophets were compassionate. They were sensitive to the oppressed. Amos said, God's judging you because you're selling the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. The prophets came from all sorts of different backgrounds. Isaiah was a city boy. Right? He was born and raised in the city, prophesied in Jerusalem. He spoke before kings. Micah, on the other hand, was a country guy. Right? He criticized the political, moral, and social corruption of the big cities. So he's the guy that comes in and says, wow, look at this urban setting. This is where all the sin and corruption was. So ideally, they served as God's advisors to and critics of the king. So some of them, like Nathan and Isaiah and Micaiah, challenged the kings, don't stray from the covenant. Fulfill your God-ordained role as shepherds of God's people. Some prophets, think of Nathan again, and Jonah and Huldah, a woman, enjoyed a positive response to their messages. Right? They were honored. But we know the other side of it. Most, like Elijah and Elisha, had all sorts of alienation and disgrace heaped upon them. The fall of Israel and Judah was due to their insensitivity and outright disregard of the prophetic word. That's why these places fell. Too often the people of Israel and Judah just resisted the prophets. They did terrible things to them. They imprisoned them. They killed them. So it says the varying treatment of these prophets shows you what was going on politically in Judah. Now, remember, Israel is the northern tribes, and Judah is the southern tribe. So unlike the northern tribe of Israel, Judah was ruled by both good and bad kings. Sometimes the kings responded to the word of the prophet, just like David did, but too often they disregarded them. But they kept on serving God. What a challenge. I mean, can you imagine doing that? And just go in front of a king who's got the power to do anything to you that he wants and say, your people need to get their act together and you need to get your act together. I think about John the Baptist, right? He did the same kind of thing and took, so much flack because of that. All right, let's do the last one here. This is Apocalypse. I think apocalyptic literature is amazing. When I used to teach the Bible as literature in college, we'd spend some time on Revelation, and what's interesting to me about it is it's not peculiar literature that just somebody who had an upset stomach stayed up one night and conjured all this weird stuff. It was an actual form of writing that was recognized during the time. People that would read apocalyptic literature were reading it as a genre. It was a kind of literature that they recognized. We don't recognize it as much today, so we get kind of lost. But anyway, so here we are. We're on page 784, so toward the end of the book. Pretty big book, huh? I'm not even at the end, and I'm on 784. Let's see. They have about almost 900 pages. All right, so what does the Greek word apocalypsis mean? Well, it's a unveiling, right? It's letting you see behind the curtain, in a sense. And it says that's the title of the final and climactic book of the Bible. Now, it said in modern literary study, Revelation and Daniel and some other extra-biblical Jewish writings have been characterized as apocalyptic literature. So they have something in common. It's agreed that the first full-blown example of apocalyptic literature is the book of Daniel. You'll see some of it also in Ezekiel and Zechariah. Let's pick up what's going on here. It said that it's mostly called apocalyptic, but prophetic apocalyptic, kind of a hybrid between the two. And it said there's a sense in which the period between the early 2nd century BC, right, so a couple hundred years before Jesus, and the 2nd century after Jesus, that was the flowering, that was the key time of apocalyptic writing in Jewish circles. So says you find some of the works in groups like the Qumran community, famous for the Dead Sea Scrolls. So we see it out there as well. So the emergence of the book of Revelation and Christ's Olivet Discourse. That's sometimes called the Little Apocalypse. It kind of represents the end of the apocalyptic literature. Right? So some of the Jewish apocalyptic writing continued a little bit more, and it gave way over time to other kinds of literature. So the apocalyptic writing flourished during the periods of foreign domination, when the Babylonians had dragged the children of Israel off to exile and clear up to the Roman Empire and times like that. So I think that's important to know, that apocalyptic literature was kind of like letting the people know that God wasn't finished with his people. There they are. They've lost their freedom. They've lost their nation. And God says, nope, big picture, you're still in it. This is still important. So what are characteristics and theology of apocalyptic writing? Well, one characteristic, they all claim to have been written by significant biblical characters. Daniel and Revelation. Now, other apocalyptic writing only asserts that they were written by like Enoch, Ezra, and Solomon, and that is probably not true. We notice in the apocalyptic writing a lot of visions and symbolism. It's almost, somebody said one time, it's almost like science fiction. You're reading, and, these wild things that are going on out there, kind of mind-blowing, showing you there's a lot more going on in this world than we think. If we just pull the veil back and see what God's up to and see what's going on outside of the material universe. So they said you get revelations, you get dreams, you get visions, and somebody is narrating it. Maybe it might be an angel, and sometimes the writer is actually caught up into the heavenly realm. Then you get Daniel doing the symbolism of those different visions that portray the sweep of history. That's interesting. It focuses on the movement of world history, especially as it relates to the Jewish people and the coming of Messiah. So they weren't just predicting the future, but they're fitting the future into a theological framework with the idea of what's coming is the Messiah. There's going to be an intervention on behalf of God's people. So like in Daniel 7, it builds on an earlier vision in Daniel 2. But it clarifies the progression of these beast-like world empires by showing that the messianic figure, the Son of Man, is going to come and do away with all of this stuff. He will deliver and vindicate his people. Some people say that apocalyptic writing is dualistic. It's God versus Satan. So we see some of that, but some spiritual warfare. But God is watching out for the Jewish and Christian people. Says two other related theological perspectives are called eschatological realism and imminent expectation, right? That some scholars describe the conclusion that the end times will be a time of great tribulation and suffering and terrible things, but there's an optimistic conclusion that God wins. So I always think of Greg Koukl. People have asked him about Revelation, and he says, I don't know, but he said, all I know is a lot of people get beat up, but God wins. Yeah, that may be a good way of putting it. I think there's some other things that, you could say about apocalyptic writing. It's usually got this big cosmic setting, not just here on earth, but you find out what's going on in the heavens. Clash of angels, clash of demons, God and Satan, and things like that. We get nature being involved, and sometimes nature does amazing things, like the earth will open up and swallow stuff, and so it's just amazing. Lots of numerology. Numbers are very, very important. The number of the beast and things like that. So fascinating reading. By the way, somebody pointed out, people scratch their head about Revelation and say, oh, this is way too tough. It's just so weird. It's not really that weird. Much of Revelation is reflecting and going back to the Old Testament. I forgot what the percent is, but it's a large percent of the references and the visions and things like that tie into, let's say, Genesis or someplace else in the Old Testament. So if you've worked your way through Revelation, congratulations. You had a challenge there, didn't you? I would say we should probably not get real hung up about trying to figure out who the Antichrist is or setting dates, for the return of Christ. We're not supposed to do that. We live in the times we were given and do what we can for the kingdom of God. Well, thank you so much for being part of this podcast. Hope your day is going well. See you later.